You're listening to Rein with Ash and Jess.
Well, I blew the mic there again. I'll start that again. Well, welcome back to the Rein podcast. This is episode number 6, and it's slowly progressing in the right direction. I haven't lost last audio. That episode's gone out.
No, that's good. Yeah, well, going out in the next hour or two, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Every time I come to film this, I get really nervous that I'm then going to press something wrong and then it is going to just completely disappear. We've got a very special podcast today, and that's not because Josh is involved in it.
It's just uncalled for again, wasn't it?
We have got Jess. Now, Jess is the real face behind the account. Paneros and Peppers. I've pronounced that right, haven't I?
Yeah.
Now, a lot of you will sort of know, if you don't, and you're living under a rock, because Dylan is the most out there. Whoa, that boosted my sound there, didn't it?
Yeah, that was a little bit too much there, wasn't it?
I realised why the sounds were really down a little bit. Dylan is a dear friend of ours and is the most charismatic young lad I've ever met in my life. And yeah, we're just going to be talking a little bit about his story, but more importantly as well, your story and behind the account. What is it? So Jess, introduce yourself for people listening. I know it's quite a big thing. Introduce yourself. Tell me everything about you, where you grew up. For the listeners, give them a little bit of a backstory to who Jess is.
Most people don't actually know what I look like when we go out to shows and stuff like that, so it's quite funny and weird talking about myself. But I mean, obviously I'm Dylan's mum. I had to think about that for a second. 31 years old.
You look good for 31, girl.
That's surprising with all the stress. Well, basically turned into like some kind of part-time nurse over the last year. But before Dylan was poorly, I rode for a living, taught for a living. Horses were just life. And then at the weekend we'd go out competing with Dills. So, yeah, I mean, there's not a huge amount to tell about me. Right. I mean, yeah, it's hard. I find it hard I can talk about Dylan for like years probably.
Yeah.
But like me, I just kind of crack on, get on with it, do what needs to be done and all that jazz and stuff like that, really.
So you mentioned in the past year, like it's changed dramatically for you.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Well, I suppose it's not really the last year because technically he was misdiagnosed for 9 months. So in October 2022, Dylan just kind of woke up. Well, no, actually, we were at, it's hard to recall it because it's such a long time ago now, but we were at our riding club's annual awards. Okay. And he must have been doing like a lot of freestyle dancing. I mean, you guys know what he's like, even now when he's like not got great mobility.
He makes me feel tired.
Exactly.
So much energy.
Exactly. So you can imagine what it was like before he was on chemo and didn't have a problem with his left leg. But yeah, anyway, he must have been going crazy on the dance floor. And the next day we had show jumping, and he's not really one to complain about pain, and he won't really tell you, which is one of the big problems that we're trying to overcome, is that he doesn't like to be a nuisance, if that makes sense. So when he says he's hurting, you know that he's hurting. And we'd gone show jumping and he was just complaining of like an ache in his leg, and it didn't really go away. So that night after the show jumping, even though it was a Sunday, I took him to out of hours GP, and they sent him straight to not Adam Brooks, it was Bedford Hospital, A&E, to have an x-ray because they thought that he had something called Perthes, which in short terms is mainly affects young boys, and on their kind of the top of their femoral head, it's not attached and it like slips, so it just makes it quite painful sometimes. Right. Anyway, they x-rayed him. We were in A&E for ages. I think that that they don't really think anything's wrong with you when they leave you to be seen last, and that's kind of how we were made to feel. And we went into the doctor's room, and he said there's absolutely nothing on his x-rays, he's absolutely fine. And he distracted Dylan, poked him where he said it hurt, and didn't flinch at all, and basically laughed and said, see, there's absolutely nothing wrong with him, he's putting it on. And then that was kind of the start of everything, really. And obviously I was then a bit like, oh, for God's sake, like, we've been in hospital for ages, like, if they're saying there's nothing wrong with him, you kind of get a little bit, not cross with him, but like annoyed that you've wasted the time.
A day, yeah.
And it was really late, and it was a Sunday night, and he had school the next day. And anyway,
how long were you sitting in A&E for?
Oh, hours, probably about 4 hours.
Yeah, because you hear so much of people sitting in there for 8+ hours, and it's like mental.
Yeah. Every time that we've been there, we've been left to sit that long. And then they were like, so he said it was chronic growing pains, or it was growing pains. I don't think it had been described as chronic by then. And to be fair, it did react like growing pains, and it was on and off. And he'd be fine, and then he might get like a couple of days of pain, and how you would expect a child to have growing pains. And then in April 2023, he obviously did competitions every weekend, but he did for the riding club this random showing show where he did a lot of in-hand work. And the next day it must have aggravated something, because he was like, again, in a lot of pain, and that was when it started to really not be as on and off and get worse. And over time, so I then obviously contacted the GP, because I'd been made to feel like a fool in A&E and didn't think that it was worth going to A&E. And they were like, oh, well, we can put you, it sounds like chronic growing pains, we can put you on a waiting list for the physio. There was loads of like little conversations here and there, because obviously it was going on for quite a long time. So in the end, I paid to have him assessed by a physio. And this, I think, was in June 2022. And no, 2023. No, where are we now? What are we now?
Oh, yeah, God, I think you mean June 2022. I think it must have been October 2021. You were saying? It was,
So a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
So 2022, and basically they said there was nothing wrong with him. It was a habitual. He had a limp by then. It was a habitual limp, and to do 3 months worth of the exercise plan that they'd given him, and to come back if it hadn't got better. And then I left it another month doing the exercise plan, and it definitely got worse. So I was like, right, that's enough. I'm taking him to A&E again.
So in that time you had no diagnosis, and like it was, the pain was in the leg, and it was just getting, and it was just becoming more and more like over a progression of time, looking and going, oh, this is actually, that's probably when you started ticking and going, something really isn't right here, because of how you're walking, with the pain that you're going in between.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, like, none of us, no one, not even the doctors, thought it was what it was, if that makes sense, because it's not known of widely enough, which is why I want to do things like this. But obviously something must have been not right, because it was getting progressively worse, and he was doing the exercises and he was still riding. The one thing he was comfortable doing, he wasn't comfortable walking, but if he was on a horse, he wasn't in any pain at all. So it must have been the way that he was positioned, that it wasn't pressing on nerves, because we later found out that it's actually it was nerve pain. It wasn't, which is why when he pressed him, it didn't hurt, because it's nerve pain.
Right, okay, I'm with you, that makes sense.
Yeah, not muscular or anything like that. But anyway, so I took him back to A&E, and again, now bear in mind this is 3 or 4 days before he was diagnosed. They x-rayed him again for Perthes, because they kept going on about that, and I'm like, but he's already been x-rayed, it's not that. Anyway, and it came back that there was nothing on the x-ray. And they sent us home and said there was nothing wrong with him, and it was chronic growing pains. And that was, again, after waiting for like 4 or 5 hours in A&E. And then the next day, I didn't send him to school because 1, he was still sore, and 2, we'd been there until like 2 o'clock in the morning. And they rang me back at about 5:30 the next day, saying that they'd reviewed all of his x-rays that he had, and it looked like there was some sort of changes, and that we needed to come back ASAP, but we had to go back and sit in A&E for another 4 hours. We waited, and they thought it was septic arthritis, so that he'd basically got an infection in his joint. So they did his bloods again to check, and the orthopaedics came over to assess him, and when they assessed him, they pressed like down really hard into the top of his hip. Now, bearing in mind, he'd never complained about any pain like above his leg. It was all his left leg, and they were like, has he been to the toilet? And I'm like, yeah, he's been fine going to the toilet. And they were like, okay. Basically, it transformed straight away. They thought it was cancer, and they knew what it was before it'd been MRI'd or anything. We got basically taken up to the ward that was there, and then that was a crazy process in itself, with kind of things, because the hospital wasn't very kitted out for children, but that's a completely different story. And then that just kind of started the journey, and that was July last year, so it's nearly coming up to a year of him having treatment now.
So I know you say it's a long process, but this or a long story, but this is that educational side of it. So I mean, this is the place to really talk about it. So was the hospital not really equipped for that, or
not really? No. So since then, since having the experience, it's like smaller hospitals that have A&E, in my mind, they should be only able to kind of deal with breaks, or like if you're bleeding out or something, they can stitch you up, they can cast you. But if they don't know what's wrong with something that's a little bit more mysterious or not known, because it was never in the back of any of their minds until they found the lump, which by that time, I can never remember exactly what it was, but it was 11 by 10 by 8 centimetres in a small 7-year-old child is absolutely massive. It's all the way from his belly button line, and his entire hip was full of it because they'd left it for so long. But obviously, because the hip is a cavity, you can't feel through it. And he was so fit, because he was still riding, he had quite strong abdominal muscles, so you just wouldn't have known. What I did notice, like the last kind of week, but I thought that because he'd been walking differently, he just kind of put his hip out, was that he had like his hip looked like it was out, if that makes sense, to the side,
almost slightly wonky.
Yeah, basically. And on his back he had like a vascular kind of area, which would have been where the tumour was, basically. Right. And then when he had his proton beam therapy, which you can go on to later, the burn that he got from it literally was the size of the tumour, and it took up like a quarter of his entire back from like his bum up. So it was massive. And if they had diagnosed him when I first took him into hospital, he would have been able to have an operation. He would have not had to have had as much treatment as he had. He wouldn't be disabled now, put it that way, and it would have been
What was the time frame again between originally going in to actually going back in and getting a diagnosis?
So it was October 2021, I'll get my years right, is when I first took him to the hospital. We didn't get a diagnosis until July 2022. God. So yeah, a long time really, and especially as Ewing sarcoma is what Dylan's got. It's aggressive, so it grows quickly. Ewing sarcoma.
Yeah, and is that quite a common type, or is it a rare? My knowledge is so
was mine. When like before all this happened, I just thought that children got leukemia, and that was what it was. But actually, his cancer is a predominantly childhood cancer. It's normally a little bit older, but it's a form of bone cancer. So there's 3 main forms of bone cancer. One that affects like elderly people, and I can never remember the name of that, which is not great, but anyway, it's not a childhood cancer. And then there's 2 that are childhood cancers. There's osteosarcoma, which is a different form of bone cancer, and then Ewing sarcoma. I'm not actually 100% what the difference is between the 2, but they're both sarcomas, and basically that just means a mass of tissue. So bone cancer isn't like, it doesn't make bone, if that makes sense. It's still a mass of like tissue, but it originates from the bone. And basically what it normally does is in teenage, it's mainly boys as well, even though we have met a girl that had it, and it's mainly teenagers because it happens when you have a growth spurt. And interestingly, Dylan actually did have a growth spurt that time that we had it. So cancer is basically when something goes wrong in your genetic makeup, and your body starts to produce too much of something. So obviously he was growing and his hip bone started to produce too much cells, and then the cells kind of got out of control, and then that's where the problem was. And the pain that he was getting is that the mass was pressing on nerves, and that was why it was making him sore.
Going back ever so slightly, so during that period of time from October 21 to July 2022, how was that affecting you?
I mean, it's hard to, because it was such a whirlwind, and my brain is quite good at self-preservation, so I think it blocks. So I had not quite as bad as this, but quite a few rubbish experiences in my life before all of this, and I'm quite good at like blocking it out a little bit, if that makes sense. But I mean, it wasn't great, because obviously you'd be walking around with a child that's limping, and people would be like, why is your child limping? And then you'd be trying to get like, and he would constantly tell you that there was nothing wrong and he wasn't in pain, but he was walking around limping. The teachers were amazing at school, especially his main teacher. I won't mention her name because I don't know about like confidentiality and stuff like that, but his main teacher was amazing at that point, and going forward, even though she's not actually his teacher anymore, she's brilliant. Texts me for updates and stuff like that, and she's just really a friend now. Quite a lot of the teachers actually at school are now, but yeah, he managed to pass all of his SATs whilst he was in
That's
huge
incredible.
amount of pain.
Absolutely incredible.
Which is why he's not actually been at school a huge amount since until recently. We're kind of trying to like
sort of
build him up a little bit, because he loved school, and he does love school, and I didn't want to throw him back in and then him hate it because he was so behind. But they weren't too bothered because he is so clever, and they said even if he missed a whole year, he would still slot back in okay. So so basically he fell asleep at school a couple of times because he was obviously exhausted. He would just be complaining, and you could just tell when he had like the episodes, he'd go like white, but he wouldn't tell you that he was actually in pain, but he might like be holding his hip and stuff like that. But I mean, like I said, he still managed to ride, and that was completely off his own back. And obviously because they were telling me it was growing pains, I wasn't like, well, don't ride, because there's something wrong with you or anything like that. So yeah, I mean, he won a dressage competition 2 days before he was diagnosed. So
wow.
Dylan was 7 when he got diagnosed, wasn't he? Mm-hmm. How does, I can't even comprehend it, how does a 7-year-old take that?
I don't think Dylan is, I mean, children do tend to be better at dealing with it because they've not got the mental part. I mean, teenagers, it affects them quite badly because they obviously know what cancer is. What's going on. But children don't really know. I mean, one thing that you start to realise after something like this happens is that it's everywhere. So like you'll be listening to the radio and there's literally, I think there was an advert when I was coming down, there's like an advert where it's like, oh, and I lost my brother to cancer, or just, and like it's really out there and it's really on the telly, and I don't think you realise that until you're kind of in that situation. And Dylan is a very bright 7-year-old child. He's not like, I don't know,
me at 7 years old.
Just flicking windows.
I had to keep myself entertained somehow, Josh.
Oh dear. But yeah, no, he's very
He
kind
can
of
pick
on it.
up on things quite quickly and educate very quickly.
He's a old head on young shoulders kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and he's always been like that. And he's great with like adults and stuff, but he picks up on things. And I remember when he was first diagnosed, he loves Marvel, and Thor come out, the new Thor, and me and Mum took him, and we were sat there in the cinema, and it started, and one of the first things that pops up is, I don't know, have you watched the new Thor, either of you?
Which one? There was one that was really bad, wasn't it? I think there was the Love and Thunder. Was it that
I
one?
think it's where his girlfriend
The Ragnarok, and then
has
there was...
so basically his girlfriend has cancer,
Oh,
and
yeah,
she's on chemo, and it pops up, and she's basically being diagnosed with cancer, and she's not got very good chances, and at the end of the film she actually dies, and I was like, maybe I should have looked this up. But it was a good thing, because it was done how she went to go save Thor and didn't have her chemo.
Right.
So it actually did the polar opposite and actually helped go.
Yeah, a little bit.
To...
Yeah, I mean, he knows that people die from cancer. Like, he's not silly. I mean, he watches like EastEnders with me, and obviously someone on EastEnders has just died. So, and I do openly say to him, like, does it scare you? And he's like, no, because obviously it's different for him, and obviously he's doing well with it. But because they left it so long, he was only given a 50% chance of coming through it, and that was before they knew it was inoperable. So that puts it down as well. I've never been given a figure after that, but I try not to ask things like that, because I'd rather not know. I'd rather just crack on and just do our best.
Well, it's living in the moment, isn't it? It's
exactly.
being appreciative for everything you've got in the time now. And I can't... The fact that you've asked him that, like, does it scare him? Like, because for me, death terrifies me.
Yeah.
And I don't know where that really stems from. So to hear Dylan at his age going through what he's going through with a response like that, it is so
empowering.
Yeah, I'm not sure he kind of looks into it hugely like that. I mean, I don't think it would, because I mean, I'm not religious, but my mum is religious, and he goes to a religious school, so he kind of feeds into things like that. But I just think he doesn't think it will happen to him, if that makes sense.
Right.
I think he just sees it as, most of the time, it's a different cancer, because going back to what you actually asked ages ago, whether it's rare, it is rare. I mean, technically, all pediatric cancer is rare, in inverted commas. It doesn't feel rare, because when you go to your hospital, there's 30 rooms, 30 beds, and they're always full. When you go to pediatric day unit, there's loads of kids running around with no hair. Like, do you get what I mean? It's
almost normal for you in that situation.
I think it's rare in the sense that a lot of adults have cancer, and maybe not as many children do, but I don't think it's as rare as it's made out. And I think people think it's rare because they don't put it on the telly. Like, when you see cancer research adverts on the telly, you don't see children with cancer, which I think it needs to be more widely put out there, and which is why I want to do things like this, because it's kind of like, I don't know, it's hard to explain, but I don't think people think there is as much of it out there as there is, and people don't know the signs, they don't know the symptoms. I mean, thinking about it, before Dylan even got poorly, I knew at least two other friends, more like acquaintances, but people that had children that had cancer. And then also since then, thinking that Ewing sarcoma is as rare as it is, 15 people a year in the UK are diagnosed with it, so that's not very many. However, I found out that one of his friends in his class's brother had Ewing sarcoma when they were a baby. That's even more rare. And then someone I know through horses Their son got diagnosed with Ewing sarcoma literally just after Dylan. So that doesn't feel as rare to me as it's kind of made out to be.
It's almost that, like, if I tell you to look for a yellow car, you'll see loads of yellow cars.
Well, it's about like the listening to all the adverts and actually realising how much it's on there, and you can't really hide them from that because it's saying that people have lost whoever to cancer.
Yeah.
You also spoke about the misdiagnosis and how it affected everything moving forward. Looking back on that, how does that make you feel? Do you have a lot of resentment and anger, or?
I mean, a little bit. It's something that maybe when we've kind of got to the point where we know exactly what's happening, because even though we're a year down the line, he's not in remission or anything like that. Right. He won't be probably for another 9 months. He's on oral chemo, so they wouldn't technically. He has to be off treatment to be in remission. So.
Just jumping in quickly, what is oral chemo for people who are listening?
Yeah, it's probably easier to go through what all of the treatments that he's had.
Let's go through the lot, because like I say, we're not uneducated, we're not educated.
No, but I mean, I didn't know anything about it before.
and it's the way I look at this, and which is why I think it's amazing that you have been able to speak with us about this, as difficult as it is. I mean, it's difficult to try and ask the right questions, but you might have a mum, a dad in that situation where no knowledge whatsoever. So let's do. Yeah,
we can go through kind of what he had. So it's funny because obviously I'm sure that you've probably had family members or people that you know that have had cancer and had to go through cancer treatment. Most of the people in my family most of the people in my family have had cancer, but everyone that we've lost have pretty much been lost to cancer, apart from my dad, who died of a heart attack. So I know a lot of people that have been through cancer treatment, but I actually didn't really know what cancer treatment was apart from chemo and radiotherapy. And I also didn't realise how different each person's cancer treatment could be as well. So what he first went on was chemotherapy. We'll call it high strength chemotherapy because it was very high strength. But I didn't realise before all of this is there's actually hundreds of chemo drugs. It's a bit like you use the word painkillers and then you've got ibuprofen, paracetamol, cocodamol, that kind of thing. He had to have chemo in hospital. He first had to have a Hickman line put into his chest, which is like a permanent cannula. It goes in his chest up and down a vein that's just above his heart. So they take blood from it. They give antibiotics if you need it. It's going to go directly into your bloodstream, but it also makes you at a really high risk that if you get an infection, which you are at very high risk of getting on chemotherapy, that it can turn to sepsis because you've got a direct access to your heart. And if you have sepsis, it's going to get pumped straight around your body straight away. So there's so many risks. If he gets a temperature, even now, over 38 or under 36, I have to take him straight to hospital. He has to go straight on antibiotics. He has to stay in hospital for at least 48 hours, having antibiotics, having his blood tests. Even if he just had a cold and he had a temperature, they would have to do that as a precaution that it could be sepsis. That happened. And then he went on to high strength chemo, which was every other week. So you would start it every other week, but each cycle was different. So you went in every other week, and then every other time you swapped what drugs you were having. So he'd go in for 6 days, and then in 2 weeks' time he'd go in for 2 days, and then in 2 weeks' time he'd go in for 6 days. And the 6 days, I can never remember exactly how it was composed drug-wise, but he had the couple of drugs that he had were vincristine, which is it's not a nice thing to have, but it's great at killing cancer. And he also had something called doxorubicin, which is it's used a lot, but it's like probably the most hardcore chemotherapy that you can have. Lots of people call it the red chemo, and it's so strong that before they give it to you, they have to give you an extra drug that coats your heart to stop it from attacking your heart and giving you heart failure. So yeah, and you have to go for echoes, and he will have to go for echoes for the rest of his life now to check his heart health. And a lot of people can't finish the course, the duration of having that drug, doxorubicin, because it makes them so poorly. It gives them so many infections that it's life-threatening in itself. But Dylan would just, in true Dylan style, skip out of hospital afterwards. Like, don't get me wrong, he was sick, and he still does feel sick sometimes. So he was sick every single time we went there. On the 6-day one, he would be sick once a day, but he would be sick and then he would crack on with playing.
I think we probably met him during his phase of high strength chemo.
Yeah, you did, yeah.
And I think we've spoken about the process of what he was going through, but it's for the listeners to make it really like clear to them. He is the happiest, most inspirational person that I think we've both been around.
Yeah, every time I'm in the presence of Dylan, it's very hard to not have his energy rub off on you. It is just so positive, and he can't sit still. He's like me. Lee is literally like a younger version of me. He's like when we went to the boxing the other day, constantly.
I know.
Like, he wanted to scrap. He wanted to scrap everyone. He saw some people kicking, and he turned to me and he was just like, "I'll do him."
But he actually wouldn't though, that's the thing.
No,
and he goes and does it, and he's like, dush. Because he's absolutely, the way I like to describe him is he's mad as a box of frogs, but he's like the kindest person. Yes. Like, he's got such a, like, he loves that idea of boxing, but he would, if he got like pushed over at school, he'd probably say thank you. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah,
he's not the kind to then get up and push someone back, because he's just not ever been like that.
No.
But yeah, no, he likes it. And
going through the chemo with him, like obviously the side effects being one of which is hair loss and all the rest of it. How does he cope with that? Because it's such an age where you have those like social stigmas and kids don't really understand. Like, no,
I mean, he didn't really go to school, so that was a big thing. And he did, if I ever said, "Oh, do you want to go and visit?" or something like that, when he didn't have hair, he would say, "Oh yeah, but only if I wear a hat." Something like that. But then he didn't really care if he was like in front of adults. Like when we came to see you guys for the first time, and you're right, he was on high strength chemo, but he wasn't just on. You would never have thought. But he was also on proton beam therapy every single day of the week, which is radiotherapy. So he was on radiotherapy and high strength chemotherapy at the same time when he came to see you guys, and he was running around like a nutter.
I remember I was sat down having a conversation with Dylan, and I was talking about, so what his interests are, just find a little bit about him. I was like, so other than horses, what sort of sport are you into? And he was like, no, it's just horses. So horses really is his passion and his love. So going into that, like, how have the horses helped his journey?
Well, I mean, hugely, I think. I think that they're probably one of the main reasons he is how he is. He didn't ride at the beginning, because one of the things his consultant, who, just to be clear, obviously we had a bad experience at the beginning, but ever since he was diagnosed, we have had like a brilliant experience, and everyone's been amazing. So it's hard to then kind of slam the NHS.
Whole services,
because it was absolutely diabolical, and it, like, could have killed him. If I'd have gone with their advice, we would be having a very different conversation. He wouldn't be here.
I think on that, I'm just slip a note in there. I think is also a fantastic highlight for the dire situation that the NHS, from the fire service perspective, I do see they're understaffed, they're underpaid,
Massively.
they're overworked, and that unfortunately is becoming so common, is misdiagnosis or waiting times or not getting the right things back, and unfortunately it isn't the hospital self its fault. It's the people at the top. That's slightly in there. I want to throw that jab while it has some relevance.
I couldn't agree more, and the way I look at it is that, like I said, I don't think that the smaller hospitals should be allowed to deal with things like that, because I genuinely think if I'd have taken him, which is annoying because it's not actually that much further, to the hospital he's treated at now, which is Addenbrooke's, he would have been diagnosed. But that's because they specialise in pediatric cancer. But the A&E doctors don't. But I just feel like they would have had some kind of grasp on it.
More of an inkling.
Yeah, because it was not even in the back of anyone's mind at Bedford or Hinchinbrook's hospitals. Like, it was just, they're obviously not trained on it. Do you know what I mean? It's not something that they're thinking of looking for. And I get that it's rare, but if he'd have had an MRI, he would have been diagnosed in October. Like, it would have come up on the MRI. And it would have, like I said, it would have been a very different situation for him. Not that, he's coped with it really well, but he still had to go through a hell of a lot. I think sometimes when you look at our page on Instagram, it's really hard because I'm trying to get across the inspiration of Dylan and the fact that you shouldn't let anything stop you doing what you want to do, because he doesn't, and he has to go through probably some of the shittest things that anyone would ever have to endure. But I think that sometimes it does take a little bit of the shine off to actually how serious, like, what he has to go through and like how bad the treatment like he has to endure is. But he just kind of gets on with it, kind of thing. So I think sometimes people probably look at it and don't actually think he's as poorly as he is.
Because of his energy and attitude.
Because he doesn't look poorly.
I'm with you.
So, sort of linking it back to what you're saying via what people see on social media, I actually remember when we last saw you when we came and I gave him the lesson that we were talking about, even on his page, you'll still get comments where people are just horrible and nasty, and you're just like, even in that moment, people still find negative comments to say. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, you kind of could forgive someone now because he's got hair, and it's hard to, if you didn't know and it just popped up on like your page and you weren't following, you wouldn't know the situation that he's in. But we had one reel that like absolutely blew up, and it was of his first competition back at dressage, and like you can clearly tell there's something wrong with him because he's putting his hat on whilst being hooked up to a chemo pump with no hair. So like, and then he's riding. But we got a few. I mean, it's not a lot compared to some people what they have to deal with, but we do still get an odd comment here and there. I don't know about his riding, or I don't know. I can't even think. I just delete them.
What do the sort of comments involve? Are they to do with like more the riding side?
Yeah, it would just be like, oh, why is his leg moving so much? And this was before I got him his specially made saddle, because he has no control over his left leg. So that's why it's moving so much. But it's just little things like that. But I go to write like a reply and then I'm just like, no, delete.
Believe me, we have all been there. I've written some replies to mine and I've had to send them to Josh and go, can I say that? And he's like, no, you will end up in prison. That is, you can't say that. But it is that mental thing that actually you look at it, especially from like my perspective, is I sit there and go, sometimes I don't anymore, but used to let comments get to me, oh, that's really annoying and I want to reply, but then how little they mean that on a page such as yours, you're still getting them. So when you still get that, oh, everyone gets it doesn't matter, and it's so isolating, you can only see your side of it. When 100%. It really puts it into perspective, actually, fuck them, it really means nothing.
Well, exactly. And I think I have to look at it that like there was thousands of comments on it, and that there was only a handful of people that would have put something negative. So when you look at it in that way, you realise that it is very much a minority of people, and I think that sometimes they're just accounts that are just trolling accounts and people just have no lives.
So bringing it back to the riding for Dylan and being such a huge part of his life, like how has that transition from before he started treatment, during treatment, and now where he's at with his riding?
So way before he was poorly, he was actually more into jumping. At one point he was kind of scoring over 80-90 courses on Inky, so like quite big really, considering Inky's, I think people don't realise how small Inky is until they see him, because he is like a very slight 12'1", 12'2". He's not, yeah, exactly, he's not big at all. I mean, he was jumping Pepper quite big when he was like 4 on his own, so he's always been like jumping, and then and Inky's not easy jumping, especially if you're jumping bigger. You have to be riding with commitment, and he did have a few, I say a few falls, he used to fall off all the time, but it started to knock him and he never used to really be bothered about falling off. And I think that it was around the time where he would have started to be like, it would have been growing, and I think that he wasn't telling me that, and maybe it hurt more than he was saying, because it kind of goes with it. And that's when we kind of went down the dressage, like, because he wasn't enjoying his jumping as much. We do a little bit of jumping, but we whacked it right down, and he kind of, like I said, he carried on with his dressage. He was doing BD Quest. He'd before he was poorly, he'd qualified for Sunshine Tours, Trailblazers, the Quest Regionals, and a couple of other championships that he didn't manage to get to because then he was diagnosed, and we'd already booked the stables and paid the entries for Trailblazers. So like, yeah, he was fully committed. And then one of the first things that his consultant that he has, his oncology consultant, he's got like 20 other different consultants, but his oncology consultant sat us down and said, don't put him on a horse, whatever you do, don't put him on a horse, because the problem is at that point is they didn't know how badly the bone was affected. Yeah. So we went for a good month and a half, I think, maybe even 2 months, and he was just doing groundwork with the ponies, which... How
did he and you both react to that news?
He wasn't happy about it, but I think because it was a bit of a whirlwind and he'd had bad experiences with things, he was just a little bit... He wasn't down, but I do think it did batter him a little bit mentally at the beginning, because going back to what went wrong at the smaller hospital is they just, if you're at a bigger hospital, they have something called a play team, and they did have a play team there, and I don't know why they didn't use it, but it wasn't as extensive, if that makes sense. And they would talk children through what's about to happen.
So is that what a play team is for people who don't know?
Basically,
okay.
Yeah. So a play therapist is someone, and they have to go to university and everything, which surprised me. They help children understand things with play therapy.
So it's, I guess, like playing out scenarios and how you, hence play therapy.
Yeah, and it's not even, when it gets to Dylan's age or older, it's not even necessarily play, it's just talking through, and they know what they're doing and talking through what's going to happen, and he had none of that. So he has PTSD with 2 things that happened at the beginning of his treatment, and that is cannulas, because the first thing they did when they put him up on the ward is pin him down in a treatment room and put a cannula in each of his hand with no numbing cream, which is really painful, especially on a child's hand that's not got as much flesh. And I've found out since that even with numbing cream, they like to put them in their arms because there's more flesh and it doesn't hurt as much. So now he is, you know what he's like as a person, but when he goes to have a cannula, he you can just see the fear take over his eyes, and he starts screaming and having a panic attack, and he's not that kind of kid that's going to have a tantrum in Tesco's floor because they're not getting what they want, because that's not what he's like, but it is almost like he kind of turns into that. And also the second thing is MRIs. I don't know if either of you have ever had an MRI.
Yeah, I've had multiple.
I've had an
Yeah,
MRI.
so me too, and they're quite scary and they're quite long
Yeah.
and they're very loud.
They really do like to kick up the claustrophobia
Yeah.
inside you, and it's like, whoa.
Exactly. They didn't speak to him about what it was. They didn't. They just basically expected him, whilst he was in agony and couldn't straighten his left leg, to lay straight on a bed in an MRI machine, and then wondered why he wouldn't do it. And then they sedated him, which I've found out since you can't actually do to a child that's over, it's either 3 or 5 years old, because it's a bit like, you know, when you sedate a horse and they start to fight it.
Yeah.
He was, the only way I can explain it, it was like he was drunk. He had no control, but he could scream and shout kind of thing. So it was almost like he couldn't, which made it worse because he felt like he was out of control, but doing something he really did not want to do.
That must have been awful for you to have to witness that.
Yeah, and I find things like that quite frustrating as well,
Yeah.
because I'm like, oh, you need to get this done because
We need to work
we
out
need
what's
to
going
know
on.
what's going on. Now, don't get me wrong, they still managed to get some images and they were very blurred, but you could see the extent of what was going on. So in the end, they just sent that over to Adam Brooks, and unfortunately the damage was done with MRIs and he was too kind of like mentally scarred with it. So he then had a couple that were under general anaesthetic, so that they could do like a full, because if you have a full body MRI, it takes like an hour and a half, which is a long time. So they did a full body just to make sure that it wasn't anywhere else. And then a couple of times later, he had to have an MRI when we were having proton beam therapy in London. And it wasn't as busy as like a mainstream hospital because they've got like their own MRI machine and their own CT scanner, and because they're still kind of on the startup of having proton beam therapy in London, they were able to like let him go and sit in it when it wasn't on. And it wasn't the machine that was scary, because he's not scared of things like that. He's actually quite brave. It was just it was PTSD. It was the experience that he was remembering, and he was almost going into like flight mode when he was in it. But anyway, that was that. And then the next day he had an MRI awake, so he's all good. He's had one recently, like not last week but the week before, so he's fine with them now.
I think what you're saying is the challenges he's faced and overcome is just absolutely exceptional. Even like you say, when he suffers PTSD and how he's now overcome the MRI scans.
Whoops.
That's all right. I'll let you put them headphones back on.
My hair in the wrong place. Yeah.
But wow, that is like, for me, I can really relate to the injections because I've got a massive phobia with needles, and I still now I can't deal with it. I passed out when I had my COVID vaccine. So
He did. I got a message directly after it. You'll never guess what's just happened. I've just fainted in a room
full of people.
Bear in mind, he is the size he is, the way he looks.
the tattoos as well, and there was like a little prick that I fainted to.
Oh dear.
Little prick is the right word.
Yeah, but something from but an outsider's perspective, looking in it, with Dylan's story, the equestrian industry really looks like it's sort of come together and supported you from my perspective anyway. Which is amazing to see, and that sort of leads it on to nicely to sort of the Be More Dylan campaign. So could you explain to, like I say, the listeners what that is and why you started that?
So it was actually the person, Emma, who owns Equinance, one day on one of our posts, I can't even remember what post it was, but she put something like, "Oh, everyone needs to hashtag Be More Dylan," and I was like, well, that is absolutely true, because they do. Like, even I try to be more Dylan, because he is just mental. Like, he's just. It's really hard to even explain what he's like unless you've met him.
He emulates what you try to internalise yourself being anyway, and when you see it, you go, "Oh, that's what it is that I want to be like."
Exactly.
But then again, he's absolutely incredible, but I don't think you give yourself enough credit. I think you're like, again, me and Ash have spoken,
100%.
like inspirational to be able to come on here, tell his story, and also talk about your own experiences, because hopefully there is someone out there that this is going to benefit.
Yeah, oh,
massively.
definitely. Absolutely. That's why I want to do it. Just kind of going off. Oh.
Ignore me, I was just checking something.
Just going off a little bit. There was a post on TikTok. I don't have TikTok. We don't have it. I find it hard to just keep on top of Instagram. So we basically have Instagram. There is a Facebook page, but I don't really post anything on it. That was just from before everything. But anyway, there was a TikTok, and it was this mum screaming out for help, basically. And in the post, it was exactly what I had gone through with Dylan. Like, I could have written it. She was going and getting sent home, blah, 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 and told that they couldn't find anything. And he would not give this little boy an MRI. And people sent, like, a couple of people sent it to me. And I'm like, and I did get in contact with them, and she has got an MRI book now. It's still not as urgent as I think it should be treated. Don't get me wrong, it might not be Ewing sarcoma, but
caution.
Yeah, I wish someone had come forward to me and told me that they thought that it might be that. I think a lot of people feel like I'm a little bit kind of say it as it is kind of thing, even with deals. I'm not kind of like a soppy person. And if I think someone needs to know something, then they need to know something, and I'm going to tell them that that's exactly with the symptoms. I don't want to scare you. It might not be that, but it could be that. So you need to have an MRI, because that's the only way that you're going to find out, or even a CT would do it, but they wouldn't give it to her. They have booked it in now, because she did, after I spoke to her, she was more forceful about it, which is good, and I hope it's not that. But what I'm trying to pull out of that is that because I've put Dylan's story out there, people were able to pick it up. I don't have TikTok, and send it to me, and
that could
I was able
potentially
to tell
help
them.
that family massively,
Yeah.
and all because of the Be More Dylan campaign that's been put out there, and that's incredible.
Exactly. So that's why I share the journey, is that one, he inspires people, but two, I think it needs more awareness. Like I said, it's not on the telly or anything like that, and I think they need to take children a little bit more seriously. It's a bit like my mum had a headache, and obviously when they put it in the thing that it was something to do with there potentially could be an aneurysm, it wasn't, but she got an MRI that day.
Yeah, it's you can't even dissect what's wrong with it, because it's such a pyramid of rubbish that needs addressing and sorting out.
It just seems to be different. The child side seems to be even worse than the adult side. And like when I'm on the cancer ward, which I'm not anymore because he has all of his treatment at home, but when I was on there, it's a running theme that is not picked up on.
It's not as consistent as if you was an adult.
Yeah.
What's the how were you able to secure any like additional funding from the government going through all of this? Because I imagine financially as well, it does take its toll.
So that's another story of something that really, really, really needs to change. So you get funding, you get benefits, but it's disability allowance, and you have to be disabled for 3 months before you can claim disability allowance, and then it takes about 8 to 12 weeks for it to come through. So that is 6 months.
Yeah, so that's...
Yeah.
Right, that feels backwards. So you could get diagnosed tomorrow, and yet actual piece of paper that says
you have cancer.
You have a disability, a registered disability. You're eligible for all this all the allowance, and then they go, right, okay, well, you're not going to receive that for 3 months.
Yeah, so they have to. I mean, I get it a little bit with some things that they might want to make sure that you are. It's going to affect your life.
It's going to be the same.
Yeah, or it's going to affect your life, and they need to also know how much it's going to affect your life. So it's done in different parts. There's a mobility part and there is a care part, and that's also on 3 tiers. So there's 2 tiers of the mobility and there's 3 tiers of the care. So there's like lower care, middle care, higher care, and then there's lower mobility and higher mobility. So you fill in a whole form, and it tells them what you're entitled to. And I do get it with some things because you need to know how your life is affected. But cancer is very different, and you are diagnosed with cancer and you have cancer. And that is unfortunately the end of it. It's not going to get better in 3 months. Even if it is something that's a bit more treatable, you're still going to be having you're going to have side effects for a long time afterwards. So yeah, basically the first, so when did we get, so we saw you guys in December, didn't we? And we had been having proton beam therapy. I'm trying to think when we actually got our disability allowance. And then I think a month before that we went down to have, they assess him and do the planning scans for the proton beam therapy. We had to stay there for a couple of days, and that's when I got it through, because I could remember being in the apartment. And the other thing is, it's very kind of like whoever your paperwork, their desk it lands on, they could make one decision, but someone else might make another decision, kind of thing. Someone might say you need higher mobility, but someone might then think you need.
It's very luck of the draw who you get.
Yeah. So you don't know what's coming through either. And yeah, so they won't pay you for the first 3 months of the disability, and we got it in about probably November time.
Do they back pay that from when you applied, or does that come straight?
You can't apply until you've been disabled for 3 months, and then it takes
3 months additionally then for it to be roughly to get passed.
Between 8 and 12 weeks it takes.
So about a 6-month process.
Yeah, about that. I think ours was slightly less, but still, and they do backdate it to when you applied.
Actually, when you apply.
But yeah, but it's more the kind of like there's other things. Then once you've got that, I can apply for carer's allowance, and like that's what we kind of live off now. It's not easy, but it's better than nothing, kind of thing.
Without being too personal, with the income that you do receive, does it go anywhere near to what you actually need to cover in itself?
I mean, it covers it.
You don't
quite
have to
savvy.
say
No.
it
Covers the basics. It covers what we need. I've always been quite a savvy person.
Yeah.
Dylan's very lucky. He gets a lot. Well, he's not lucky. I always feel like, why do you say that? Because he's not lucky, is he? But he is lucky because he gets a lot of nice things from companies and stuff like that. So I mean, that is one thing that I then don't have to go and spend money on. But really it only covers the bare minimum. And then you've got to think of, like, I had a Toyota Yaris before all this came, and then Dylan needed a wheelchair, and you're not going to get a wheelchair on the back of a Toyota Yaris. So he needed to get a bigger car, and it's just like things like that.
No, you have a Lamborghini Urus.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. I wish. But yeah, I need a bigger car, and just the
whole domino effect just starts to pick up. I'd imagine it like people that are in like long-term wheelchair situations, then you need to start looking at disability ramps and making it like proofing your home.
That probably will be him when he's older as well. So exactly. And we live on a first floor flat, so he's all right because he's quite nifty anyway with his crutches, but like he used to have to go up and down the stairs on his bum when he was really sore, or I'd carry him, but he's quite heavy, so it's not easy going up and down the stairs. But yeah, I mean, it covers what we need. The first 3 months I was lucky that I had a bit of savings, not much, but a little bit, and that wiped that out. And then what you get when you get diagnosed with cancer, or your child gets diagnosed with cancer, it's called a social worker, but it's not a social worker. It's like a charity. So there's a charity called Young Lives versus Cancer, and they are like Macmillan, but for children. So Macmillan don't help children, they only help adults with cancer. Young Lives versus Cancer help children, and you get assigned a social worker from them, and they are brilliant. Like, you get a grant from them anyway, and then they kind of look at who will give you grants or counselling. I haven't actually opted for any of that yet, but they will sort it out for you or anything like that, and they just check in with you. And yeah, they got us quite a few grants, and then if you kind of search all over the internet and find another little mini charity that would give you a grant, they can do like the paperwork to confirm that you can have the grant and things like that. So we must have got quite a few grants. We did get a few grants at the beginning, varying from like £100 to like £500, which is amazing. But in the grand scheme of things, when you've got a house to run on your own, so I'm a single parent with Dills, so I run the house entirely on my own, no other income. Even £500 is less than the rent. So yeah, and then you've got 3 months worth of it. So it was a struggle for the first.
Yeah, and then you add in the cost of living that's going up and everything.
Yeah. And having horses as well.
Yeah, of course. And it's such a difficult one because from the other perspective, the first thing that someone could argue is, okay, we'll get rid of the horses. But
that's not going to happen.
That's the one thing that's keeping him going. So it's almost like a double-edged sword of weighing up. It's just so, it's so difficult.
I am lucky because like we've got, it doesn't, even though we've got 4 horses now, but at the point in time we had 3, because when he was poorly, one of my friends gifted him a foal, but that doesn't cost us any money at the moment, and that's been amazing for him too, because he's been able to kind of like
grow with
him.
A bond almost.
Exactly. And he still lives with kind of her herd of Welsh ponies, so he's not with our guys, but we've got 3, and we've got like a yard that I'm the sole renter, and then my friends are on it, so it costs a lot less than if I was at a livery yard. And then because I do have amazing friends, because we would obviously be in hospital for like half of the month, so they would look after them, and they are easy. They live out, they have a round bale with a net over it and all that jazz, but it's still someone that needs to go and feed them, check them. And my mum, who isn't horsey at all, would go and poo pick and stuff like that. So everyone was like brilliant, and the horses in the grand scheme of things are not, they don't cost us very much. I'm lucky to kind of be able to get good priced hay and stuff like that because of knowing people and all that.
It's that old famous saying is, with tragedy brings community.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think they would, even if it wasn't a tragedy. I'm very lucky, like with the friends at the yard, we help each other even when we go on holiday. Like we'll look after there's no kind of like, you don't have to pay for anyone to look after your horse. You know that they're going to be looked after. So that was kind of the easiest part. It's more running the house that was more of the worry for the first 3 months, but that is something that does definitely need to change, because people should not just be dropped and left.
No. Is there any anything in motion to like put towards parliaments or
I don't
anything?
really know.
Is this something that you can maybe spearhead? And
it is something that I have thought about, kind of like when all of this is over as well, just thinking about what I would want to do, even though since thinking about that, learning that Dills is going to be disabled for the rest of his life, so he is going to still need quite a lot of help and care, and he'll be progressively disabled, so his condition will get worse over time, and he will lose more and more use of his left leg. So it may be not be as easy for me to be able to do stuff, but definitely when he's off chemo. So at the moment, even though he's on oral chemo, which I don't actually think I even got to actually explaining what it is, but it's basically, so some children would keep their Hickman line and have it injected down it, and you'd have to go to hospital every week. And you would have a teeny tiny tablet pretty much every day, and then you'd go and have it and push down your line once a week. But Dylan decided that he doesn't want to have to go to hospital every week, and he wants to take the adult pills. So he swallows massive
Gazer.
huge pills so that he doesn't have to go and have it pushed down his line. So we have it all at home. So once a month we go to hospital. They see him. They say he's still Dylan. He's fine. He has to have regular blood checks anyway. And basically he has a tablet on Monday, Wednesday, Friday and Sunday, which is a little one, and then every Friday for 3 weeks, and then a week off of the big tablet he has. And the big tablets do make him feel a bit like crappy, but we've worked out that if I give it to him just before he goes to bed, he's not sick because he just sleeps off. But when he was having to have it at the beginning at hospital, where they injected it down his line once, and also then they watched him take the pills to make sure that he would take the pills, he was sick when we kind of got to the yard. But he'd be sick on the muck heap and then go and ride. He's not like bothered by it or anything. He's just gets on with it, doesn't care. But that's oral chemo. And sorry, my voice is about to go. Oral chemo is so high strength chemo. It attacks any cell that is multiplying rapidly, which is why your hair falls out, which is why you become immune suppressed, really badly immune suppressed, and it's why some people get huge ulcers in their mouths, because everything that is multiplying fast, it attacks and it kills, whereas oral chemo it just mops up a single cell. It will stop a single cell from multiplying.
Get it down, you go. Hydrate, always a key.
I'm talking
remember
too
to
much.
drink water, kids.
I've never spoken so much for so long. So oral chemo will grab like one cell that's floating around. So it won't stop if something is actively growing inside of him, cancer-wise, the chemo that he's on will not stop it, which is obviously terrifying because that could be happening. He has just had a scan and it come back and it was actually smaller, which is, again, in true Dylan style, doesn't normally happen when you're having oral chemo, but it's not grown, so...
That's all good.
Well,
Ignore that. That's the laptop being the laptop.
but that in itself is fantastic news, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, yeah. And like everyone always says, I don't know how you kind of cope. And to be honest, coped absolutely fine in the first bit because you're kind of just going with what is being thrown at you. But actually, I still coped well, but it was much harder once like the high strength chemo stopped, because then you're kind of it's not so bad for him because he's got oral chemo too, so at least you've got that a little bit of a safety blanket there, but you are still kind of thrown into the wind a little bit and you don't really know what's going to happen, and everyone always goes, oh, is it going well, and like, how's he getting on? And it's like, well,
you don't really have an answer.
You can't answer that until it's gone for at least 6 months, and that's after treatment finishes. So you don't know, like, you are still kind of, you just have to keep going. And
so there's no sort of like time trajectory. We know at the moment Dylan's on your oral chemo, and it's the tumor, not tumor, but the cancer itself has shrunk a little bit. There's no sort of trajectory. Is he going to be? Is there a place of remission in the near future, or is it the long future?
So it's hard because his is inoperable. So what they would usually do is they would attack it with high strength chemo. He had 14 courses of that, and it shrunk dramatically, but it still left a fairly large residual mass. But on an MRI, it looks dead, but you can never 100%.
If you can't operate, you can't tell.
Exactly. And also the fact is, so what they would do is they would blast it with chemo, then they would take it out, and then they would give you radiotherapy to make sure that there was nothing still there, and then you would be monitored. and I'm not sure how far after that you would be classed as remission. But that's what would normally happen, and that's what would have happened if they'd have diagnosed him earlier. So Dylan's is inoperable. The main reason his is inoperable is because it covered his tailbone when it was at its largest, and they will never take... So with bone cancer, you have to remove the affected bone for it to be possible. You have to remove the affected bone and all of the area that the tissue, that the mass has been in, even if it's shrunk. It's not just what it's shrunk to. They have to cut all of the area that it's touched. You have to do that with every cancer, but the bone has to come too. So they would have to take his pelvis out, and they'd have to take his tailbone out. And they will not remove a tailbone because that's what sits you upright. They just won't do it. So they won't take out your tailbone because you're basically not got a quality of life.
No, does that, I take it affects the spine and that, so
your spine would collapse.
Yeah, so yeah, it renders your legs useless.
Yeah, and your whole body basically.
Yeah.
Your arms might move and your head, but
yeah,
it would just be...
It's not the quality of life.
No, they won't do it. So at the beginning they said it was inoperable, so the plan was high strength chemo for 14 courses. Then he had proton beam therapy, which is a relatively new form of radiotherapy that is used mainly instead of operating, because it's so precise and so high strength. It doesn't really affect any of the tissues around it. And then he also had to have radiotherapy on his lungs because it had spread to his lungs a very, very small amount, but it was still there, like a couple of millimetre dots, which went in like one course of the first MRI, no, the first CT scan. His lungs were clear, so that was good because that was gone. But by the end of all the radiotherapy and the high strength chemo, there was still quite a large residual mass, much bigger than they would normally expect, but it still looked dead, and there's no scientific research to prove that just because it's a bigger mass that's left over that it's more likely to come back, because they did then put it back to the surgeons and say, would you take it out? And the surgeons came back and said, yes, we would take it out. But it would be something called mutilating surgery, which is like the step above amputation. So obviously by the name,
I didn't realise there was a step above amputation.
Yeah.
I thought amputation was pretty as far as it gets.
Well, exactly, when you know it's worse than that. So they would take... he wouldn't necessarily lose his leg, even though we found out now that he probably would have if he'd had that operation. But there is a very high chance that he would lose his leg. But they would take his pelvis out. They can't replace pelvises, so they would just put a load of rods just to prop it all together, and like he might be able to put his leg down and just like prop on it kind of thing. But he would be in a wheelchair most of the time. And yeah, like I said, he would have probably lost his leg, but they wouldn't take his tailbone out. So we decided that we didn't want to put him through that, because what's the point of putting him through that when they're not actually taking all of the affected area out?
No.
And also Ewing sarcoma is nearly just as likely to come back in a different bone as it is to come back in the primary place. So you took all of that out. If it started growing again, we wouldn't have an option. They would just take it out. But we got the option of it, and when you get the option, you kind of know. And they also said just because it can be done, doesn't mean it should be done.
They have to present to you every option on the table, whether the ideal option or not. They have to present it, don't they? His
medical team were all very against it, knowing Dylan. The surgeon said it could be done, but they didn't really know Dylan, so. And they were like, well, what about his riding? I'm like, well, I don't really... Like, we will always find a way for him to be able to ride, even if he's got no legs. Do you get what I mean? Yeah. It's that they need to not think about it like that. And I'm like, you can't put that on the table, because it doesn't matter about his riding. He will always be able to do something with the horses. I don't care if he has to have his leg off. Like when he first came, before we knew it was inoperable, they were like, he is going to lose his leg. And I was like, fine, that's fine. I don't care, kind of thing. Obviously I do care, but I don't care as long as he's here.
The grand scheme of things, it's the priority.
Yeah, so since all of that's happened, and we said no, so his scans came back that there was no growth from his first one, which is brilliant, because that was like literally torture, thinking, especially as you don't really find out for quite a long time. Well, it's not a long time, but it's like a week at least. And that's quite a long time to be like, oh God, is it coming back? Is it not? And something else that had been a bit of a red flag for me was that with the chemo that he had, he almost nearly entirely lost his limp.
Right.
And then about a month or two ago, it started coming back again. And I was like, that was one of his main
concerns right at the beginning.
Yeah, one of the main symptoms. But it was coupled with pain, and he was absolutely adamant that he wasn't in any pain, into the fact that he was getting a bit pissed off with me asking him every 5 minutes, do you hurt? And I did believe him, because he wasn't like he was still happy, he didn't look like he was in pain, but he was like walking like his leg was it is shorter than the other, but a lot shorter, like dipping. So obviously I highlighted the concerns to his consultant, who felt him and said, he's quite can't think of the word. If he thought there was anything wrong, he'd be in for an MRI the next day.
He's honest with how he feels.
He's pushy. Like it's not normal for Dylan to be on oral chemo, but it's like a just in case, and we had to sign a load of paperwork because his consultant wanted to put him on it, because it's just in case. And I'm like, I'd much rather do too much than too little, kind of thing. But it's not actually part of the treatment plan for Ewing sarcoma. So he's very much proactive, I think, is.
What a brilliant person to have around you.
Yes, definitely, because one thing that I think that the NHS is, it's very reactive. It's not very proactive. So it waits until there's something wrong with you, and then they try to fix it, whereas they don't try to not like the thing to not be wrong with you. But anyway, that's a completely different thing. So that's why he's on that. And obviously I was freaking out a little bit, not massively. I'm quite good at trying to be calm.
How do you manage that though?
I don't know, if I'm honest. When I, obviously, like I mentioned before, I had friends that have children with cancer, and I would literally look and think, how would you even cope with something like that? Because that is like, I think really, if I'm honest, I think it's worse than having cancer yourself, because
it's the ones around you, you're to live alongside
it's your child. Like, it's your child that has a life-threatening disease, like, and it's even worse than that, really, isn't it? It's cancer, and you do wish that you had it and not them, and that is obviously, you can't do that, but you kind of just have to, because it was awful. The first couple of days was not great, and I wasn't in a very good place, but then I just thought to myself, I can't, like, it's just something what do? You can't cry every minute of every day. You've got to get on with it, because otherwise, and I think that's probably, I was like, I need to make everything as normal as possible for him, so that he can cope with it. And I think that's why he is kind of how he is, because I don't wrap him up. I don't stop him from doing what he wants to do, even though riding is very risky for him. But then it is,
he's having a life.
Risky anyway.
He's got to have some enjoyment.
Exactly.
He's got to live a life that he enjoys.
Exactly.
And I think there's a lot of people, cancer completely aside with it, would say, well, if I wasn't doing what I'm doing, then I wouldn't want to be here doing anything else anyway. And it's exactly the same principle.
Exactly. And you could fall off and break your neck even if you're an able-bodied person. Like, it's quite easy to hurt yourself on a horse. And that kind of is what I was like, because I got the go-ahead for him to be able to ride a little bit on lead rein, and then it slowly progressed to walk off lead rein. And then he was trying behind my back. And then it was actually not long after we saw you guys, I just thought, do you know what? Fuck it, I'm going to let him canter. And then that kind of just went from that, and I was like, I don't even care. And then, to be fair, when we then went to Stanmore, which is the orthopedics hospital, I was speaking to him, and he was like, I'll never stop him from doing anything. So he's who looks after his bones. He's the one who said he would do the surgery, basically. But he was like, I'd never stop him from doing anything. If he wants to do it, he can do it. But obviously there are the risks of if he falls off, his hip will collapse into itself. It won't break. It will just it's soft, so it will just fold into itself. And that's going to happen over time anyway. So it's going to happen anyway. So if he falls off, it's not going to be great. And obviously we take a lot of precautions with his safety wear. You can't really protect his hip that much. But yeah, and going back to him starting to limp again, basically his consultant thought that it was the damage from the radiotherapy. So his hip was already very damaged from the cancer, and then he's had loads of radiotherapy, of the proton therapy in his hip, and that's basically fried the bone even more. And then what came back from the MRI that was great, because it had shrunk, or there was nothing in his lungs, was that he had something called avascular necrosis, which is at the top of his femoral head, so the top of his femur, where it slots into your hip bone. Basically, because of the amount of radiation that he's had in his hip, it stopped the blood flow so all the blood vessels were killed, and it stopped the blood flow to the top of his femoral head. So eventually that will die and collapse as well. So that's probably why he started to limp, even though I think he's got better with his walk again now. I don't know if
and
it's
all
muscles.
of this he's fully aware of that's going to happen down the...
Yeah.
I don't know how he does it like that. There's such a...
I don't know if he quite understands that part, but we went through a phase of not really making him use his crutches that much, because it's quite hard. It doesn't hurt. So even as an adult, if you were given some crutches right now and said you need to use these and not use your left leg, you'd be like, well, my brain is telling me to use my left leg because it doesn't hurt. So, but I got more strict, and I am going to get more stricter, because it's not just his hip now, it's obviously his leg as well. But I think that he is so mobile because he is so strong from his riding, because obviously the riding has no...
Probably helps him so much, 100%, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And it's got no direct impact to the joint, so that's why he's all right doing it and he's not all right walking. It's because obviously he sat on the horse, and it's not any direct impact to his hip joint.
I think what we've spoken about is an incredible story about, firstly, you and how you've managed to deal, and everything you've gone through, and what an amazing person Dylan is.
Yeah.
How I'd like to wrap this up would be if you were talking to yourself on the day that he was diagnosed. So if someone's listening to this and they're going through this situation, what would you say to them?
God, that's actually quite hard. Obviously it would have to be specifically that. I don't really know. I just think that you just have to kind of take it as it is and as it goes, and it changes a lot. From what we were first told to what we're kind of going through now, it changes a lot. So you just have to kind of just go with whatever your consultant, and it's hard because if you were in the situation that I was in, you were massively let down at the beginning, so then to actually listen to the organisation that had massively let you down is hard.
Any organisations that you'd recommend?
Young Lives versus Cancer will reach out anyway, so take all of the help that you can.
I'll find them and I'll put them in the link and the bios and stuff like that, so people can actually... Yeah,
and they're brilliant, and if anyone wants to donate any money to charity, that would be the Tock charity. We've got quite a lot of... We just did some fundraising for them with the school. I've had a few people run the marathon in aid of them for Dylan. They are kind of the number one, them and kind of cancer research, I would say, are the top ones. There are a lot, probably about 15 charities that have helped us.
Yeah, Sam's boxing for Dylan.
Exactly. Cancer
2 weeks.
research,
We will see you there as well. We'll be
there cheering him on.
Gattered, absolutely spangled at that point. Is the boxing. Of course we will be.
You need to wait to see what Dylan's wearing.
I can't wait to see him.
I really hope it is a half step sort of custom made.
Yeah, it's not, but
disappointed.
No, seriously though, it's probably the like coolest thing that he could wear. There.
Oh, amazing.
yeah.
Love that.
Amazing.
Jess, thank you for being so honest
okay.
and open, and like I say, it's not. It's a difficult conversation to have, but someone listening may really take away a lot from it, and especially everyone in the equestrian industry knows Dylan and his perseverance and strength and charisma, but you also need a platform because of the amount of strength that you have to hold that together. It is absolutely inspiring, and
he is a reflection of you.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, you say it's a difficult conversation, but I quite like talking about it. Not like, obviously, but
it's like therapy.
Yeah,
in
I mean,
ways.
it's nice. I want to get his story across, and like, if anyone ever actually wants to know things, they need to not feel awkward about asking, because I'm always happy to kind of like explain what is this, what is that. There's so much, literally I could talk for hours about it, and like we've kind of talked about some of it but gone off on a tangent here and there. But yeah, so if like anyone has listened to this and they want to know more about something that maybe I haven't actually finished the question, because I'm aware I do that quite a lot, just give us a message, because
on Instagram it's Panaero and Peppers. That's how people can find you. Everyone, thanks again for watching, for listening, and the sharing. As always, share content. Again, this is one of those episodes that something specifically in it might be clipped, and the more people that share it might genuinely reach someone that needs to hear it. So make sure you're following and subscribe to everything to listen to everything that's coming in. But Jess, thanks for coming on.
No problem.
And we will see you guys on the next one. Peace. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Well, that was really nice. By the way, you said bye bye.